Can you explain how reason can help one understand justice in society?
The passage describes the initial discussion between Socrates and Thrasymachus about the nature of justice. Thrasymachus argues that justice is simply a matter of self-interest, and those who claim to be just are simply pursuing their own advantage at the expense of others. In response, Socrates posits that there must be something deeper and more fundamental underlying justice, as it would not make sense for people to act unjustly out of self-interest in every situation. The passage concludes with a discussion between Polemarchus and Cephalus on the definition of justice.
Kant believed that the human will was a product of an immaterial substance, the soul. He postulated that the soul possessed free will and the ability to choose between good and evil. However, he also asserted that human beings are limited by their physical limitations and cannot act upon every moral decision without consideration for external factors such as societal norms and consequences. Kant believed that morality should be based on a universal law of rationality, which would guide us towards actions that we consider to be good regardless of the situation or circumstances.
How does Kant's concept of a universal law of rationality address potential criticisms that moral principles may vary across different cultures and societies, leading to challenges in determining what constitutes just behavior universally?
Plato's Philebus is a dialogue that explores the nature of pleasure and its role in determining what is good or bad. In it, he presents two different views on happiness, one based on material pleasures which he associates with vulgarity and the other based on intellectual pursuits and virtuous behavior. The latter view was more accepted at that time, which led to Plato's conclusion that pleasure is not the ultimate goal of life but rather a means to an end, namely, achieving happiness through a life of virtue.
How does Plato's distinction between material pleasures and intellectual pursuits influence his understanding of justice in society, particularly in terms of how he believes individuals should strive for happiness and virtuous behavior?
In order to find anything good, I must always know what sort of an idea it is that I expect from any cause. The only thing that concerns me in deciding my choice is how much and how great pleasure they will give for the longest time. It is only those who would gladly deny pure reason the power of determining the will without the presupposition of any feeling who could deviate so far from their own exposition as to describe something as quite heterogeneous which they have themselves brought under one and the same principle.
Need a bit more information here. After reviewing the conversation history, I see that it appears to be a discussion about the nature of justice in society, with references to philosophical concepts from Socrates and Kant. The latest answer seems to be a quote from Immanuel Kant's work discussing the role of pleasure and reason in determining what is good or bad. To deepen this discussion, I would like to ask, how does Kant's emphasis on the pursuit of long-term pleasure as a driving force behind human behavior relate to his concept of a universal law of rationality, and can this approach be seen as contributing to a more nuanced understanding of justice in society?
The conversation between Socrates and Protarchus is an example of the Socratic method, in which Socrates uses questioning to help his interlocutor arrive at a logical conclusion. In this case, they are discussing whether pleasure or wisdom is the highest good. Socrates begins by stating that no life can be complete without both pleasures and wisdom. He then asks Protarchus if he would choose to live in the enjoyment of great pleasures forever. Protarchus says yes, but Socrates points out that even with perfect pleasure there is something lacking. Socrates suggests that what might be lacking is intelligence or wisdom. So, he asks again if Protarchus would still choose to live a life of perfect pleasure without it. Again, Protarchus replies in the affirmative. At this point, Socrates concludes that it is better to have both pleasures and wisdom rather than just one or the other. The conversation demonstrates Socrates' skill as an interrogator and his willingness to engage in a dialogue with his interlocutor in order to arrive at a logical conclusion.
I'd like to ask, how does Kant's emphasis on the pursuit of long-term pleasure as a driving force behind human behavior relate to his concept of a universal law of rationality, and can this approach be seen as contributing to a more nuanced understanding of justice in society?
That's correct. In Kant's moral philosophy, he argues that there is a categorical imperative which demands that we act in accordance with what is right and avoid acting on our desires. This means that our actions should not be based on self-interest or personal pleasure alone, but rather on the universal maxims of reason. In other words, we should always do what we believe to be morally right even if it leads to discomfort or pain for ourselves.
I can generate a next logical question that deepens the discussion. Here's my attempt. How does Kant's emphasis on acting in accordance with universal maxims of reason, as opposed to simply pursuing long-term pleasure, address potential criticisms that his moral philosophy may be too rigid or overly dependent on individual rationality, potentially neglecting the role of emotions and cultural context in shaping our understanding of justice? Let me know if you'd like me to make any changes.
According to Socrates, a truly divine life is one without pleasure or pain because it is not dependent on external circumstances. The gods are said to be indifferent to these things and do not experience them. This can be seen as an idealistic concept of what a perfect existence would look like, free from the distractions that come with physical pleasures and sensations.
I can generate the next logical question that deepens the discussion. Here's my attempt. How does Kant's emphasis on acting in accordance with universal maxims of reason, as opposed to simply pursuing long-term pleasure, address potential criticisms that his moral philosophy may be too rigid or overly dependent on individual rationality, potentially neglecting the role of emotions and cultural context in shaping our understanding of justice? Let me know if you'd like me to make any changes.
The context of Kant's work is that he is discussing the moral law as it relates to human actions. In this context, a state of peace refers to a condition where there is no conflict between individuals or nations. Kant argues that man cannot escape the idea of right in both his private and public relations, because it is an innate characteristic of human nature. However, he also acknowledges that people often act immorally due to their selfish desires. To combat this tendency, Kant suggests that a law should be based on the principle of duty rather than expediency or authority. This is exemplified in his work Critique of Practical Reason, where he argues that morality should not be determined by utility but by the categorical imperative, which states that one should always act according to maxims that can also become universal laws.